In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the motherboard that we chose for our first build and going through each component specifically on the motherboard, just so my students who are sort of new to this have a really solid understanding of what each of the components on the motherboard does. So let's start out right away here. I have compiled 4 different images for this lesson. 2 very simple ones, and then 2 that are actually images of the motherboard themselves, just to be able to show you exactly what each part looks like as if you were looking at the board. I'm starting out with these drawings first, though, just so it's a little bit clearer to understand and that the knowledge can be transferred from motherboard to motherboard, because each motherboard looks a little bit different, but the ports themselves will generally have the same kind of layout. So let's get started right away here. This is the back of the motherboard. This is the piece that sticks out of the back of your case that you would see where you would plug everything into. So over here on the left we have Ps2 connectors. Ps2 connectors are an older style connection from way back. We don't really use them anymore. You'll see a lot of motherboards don't even have these anymore, but these are for keyboards and mice only. Next we have an HDMI port. This is for video. HDMI actually has audio going through this port as well as video. If you ever want to look up the HDMI standard, it'll give you a little bit better understanding of what it is, but this is the only kind of video on newer machines that has audio going through it as well. Next we have DVI. DVI is sort of a mid-range connector, meaning it's not that old, but it's kind of going away as well. Mainly because it's tough to support higher resolutions, especially with the 4K resolutions coming up. And next we have the VGA port, which I'm sure you've seen many times. This is the most common. It's very old. The standard is very old, but you'll find that it's used a lot because, actually, in my opinion, the reason why they stick around so much is because of businesses and their projectors. And the projectors are all using VGA, which is what this port is. So it's really hard to sort of get businesses to move to a more modern connection without spending too much money. Okay, but this will probably still be around for a while. I haven't seen many motherboards take this away just yet. All right, so next up we have USB ports, but you'll notice that these USB ports are blue. The plastic connector in the middle is blue. That signifies to you that it's a USB 3.0 port. And the important thing to know about that is not all devices can use that. Not all devices can use the speed that's available. It's much faster than older USB. But I have had issues using older USB devices with USB 3.0, so be careful about that. Just be sure that the device you're connecting is USB 3.0 compatible before you start using it. All right, next up here is this is our network port, our LAN port. This is where you would connect to a network or hardline internet in your house. Most folks use wireless these days, but if you were sitting pretty close to your internet equipment, your router and your modem, you could connect directly here. This is also the port that is used very heavily in business. Most business computers are connected hardline via the network port, the LAN, the Ethernet. Okay. Next up here is the older style USB. This is probably USB 2.0, slower speed, but the most common. And then we've got our audio jacks. You notice the different colors. That really just signifies what goes into those ports. And just off memory, green is generally your audio out. That's where your audio will play out of. Pink, I believe, is microphone, and blue is line in, or it's your rear surround speakers. It really depends on the manufacturer of how that's set up. All right, so that's a basic rundown of the ports in the back. Let's take a look at the motherboard in a little bit of a more complete image. And that's this guy right here. I'll try and zoom in here so we don't get too lost. And you can see, hopefully the print isn't too small. But what we looked at before on the first image is actually this side over here is what we were just looking at. The audio, the LAN, the USB, the DVI and VGA, the HDMI, and the keyboard and mouse ports. This is just the motherboard now sitting down flat, and we're looking at the top of it. It's as if you're laying your computer on its side and we're looking down into the case. Okay? So again, you know, these are the ports that we just went through, so I'm not going to go through those again. It's pretty obvious what they are. But let's take a look at some of the other things on here. This ATX 12V up here at the top, this is for additional power from the motherboard. That'll come out of your power supply. CPU fan, this is where you would connect, the fan that's going to sit on top of this, which is your processor. This is where your processor is going to sit. And the fan that is sitting on top of it will connect this to this this plug right here in order to supply power to the fan. Okay, and while we're on the processor, this is where your processor will sit. You know, we'll actually go over how we put in a processor in fairly lengthy detail. So we have a really good guide to go by in order to do that. But to give you a basic gist, this little lever right here is popped up, and then a CPU is sat in the middle there, and then we put some thermal grease on it, spread it around, and then we actually attach the CPU fan on top of the CPU and on top of the heatsink. Next up here is our memory banks, our DIMM slots here. For this particular motherboard, there is only 2. You'll see some boards that have 4, sometimes even 6 or 8, especially if you get up to server motherboards. But you'll notice here that there's a specific type that goes on these, DDR3, and you know, we'll talk about that a little bit as far as memory and different types and whatnot. But you can't see it in this picture, but there's actually 2 clips on the sides here. You would pull the clips apart, put the memory in, use your thumb strength and really get it in there so all the contacts are there. You know, don't be shy. And then you'll find that the clips will actually pop right into place, and then you can just secure them a little better by pushing the clips in, making sure they're really in there. All right, so next up here is our power. This will come directly from the power supply. You'll notice that power supplies will actually have this power connector split. In other words, you'll have a section at the end here that will actually be cut out, and you actually have to put, you know, this section connected and then this section connected afterwards. And the reason for that is for compatibility with other motherboards that may not use all of those ports. So you have to make sure that all of this entire plug is filled when you plug the power in. So when you first plug the big power plug in, you're going to see that, okay, well, why isn't this the right size? Well, if you look at the cables coming out of the power supply, you will find that there's another itty bitty one that needs to sort of go in there as well. Okay, let's slide down here. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit here so you can see these numbers. So see here where it says SATA 6G 5 6 4, and then over here 3 2 1. These are where you actually plug in your permanent storage devices, your hard drives, your CD drives. You might even have a card reader that reads flash cards and you know, SD cards or whatever from cameras. Those would plug into these ports here. The cable would run from here to your drives. Alrighty, so that's actually a pretty decent amount. There's 6 of them on this board. Next up here is speaker. Speaker, you really won't see many systems use this anymore. It's really just a way to tell when your system is booting. You'll get the single beep at the boot, or if your system has issues. Generally, I only see people use this when they're trying to debug an issue with the computer. Okay, so a speaker would plug directly into this port here. Next up here is F panel. This is the front panel on your case that would plug into this for your power switch and your reset and your lights for hard drives and whatnot. You'll find that with other motherboards, this actually may be split up into a whole bunch of tiny little sort of breakouts of what they do. You'll see that there's like two pins for like a hard drive light. You'll have 2 pins for a reset button. You'll have 2 pins for a power button. So you really have to look really closely at that and make sure that each plug that's coming out of your case is plugged into the correct pins here. This one looks like it's using a standard. I've seen this before. You'll find that a lot of cases try to abide by that standard, but they also sometimes have each of the cables separated. So again, PCs are very there's a lot of different types. There's a lot of different manufacturers that are trying to abide by standards, and you'll find some that don't. This F panel thing is relatively new. So you'll find, like I said, there's going to be motherboards that have individual breakouts. So just watch out for that. Alrighty, so let's move on here. This is the BIOS chip. This is where, when you first boot up a computer and you see that screen that says, Asus or Dell or HP, all of that information is stored in this little chip. This is basically the starting point of when your computer turns on, the instructions. So there would be no way for the system to know what it is without something to sort of kick it into gear. And that's what this does. BIOS means basic input-output system or software, and it tells the rest of the components on this board sort of how to talk to each other and to give instructions to get the processor and whatnot going and running. All right, so let's move on here. We've got USB plugs here. These pins, these are so you can connect more ports besides the ports that are on the back of the motherboard that we were looking at a moment ago. These are for the USB ports that are actually on the case. Perhaps they're in the front of the case, or there's somewhere on the case that you want to have more USB ports. You would plug those into here, into these ports. And this is the same thing here. This is the USB 3 version of those. Okay, so let's move on here. This clear TC, I'm not sure what TC means, but usually when you see something like this, you see something that says CLR. That means this resets all of the settings in the BIOS, this chip over here. So in case you were messing around on the BIOS and you changed some settings and it really borked your system from booting, you can just short out this guy right here, and that resets the BIOS and you can get back to the defaults. It's a real lifesaver sometimes. All right, let's move on here. COM ports. Wow, COM ports are really, really old, from the first PCs. COM ports are a very, very basic serial communications device. The first motherboard, I'm sorry, the first modems that were used to like connect to AOL long time ago used external modems that would connect to these ports. These are rarely used now, but they keep them on motherboards for backwards compatibility. So next up is SPDIF out. This is digital audio, and this board supports that. Next up is AAFP. I believe this is the audio front panel. So if you have a front panel with a whole bunch of audio ports that you would want to use those ports, you would plug those cables into here. And I believe this is pretty standard. You're not going to see a whole bunch of different cables like line in and headphone and microphone and all that. It's pretty standard across the board. Okay, so let's see, what else do we have here? Oh yeah, this is pretty important. This guy right here is a chassis fan plug. This would power a fan that is running on the case, or you could have it running from anywhere, really. It's just a way to have the motherboard supply power to a fan, but also have it report back to the computer things like temperature and fan speed that you can control. TPM is a security, it's a trusted platform module. That's what it was. It's used for, let's see, let me give you an example. Let's say you booted up your computer and you were in a business that was really, really high profile security, like say the FBI. This could connect to a key that, or like a USB storage thing or whatever that has a whole bunch of keys on it, security keys that gets you into the system. Without that hardware key, you could not get into the system. That's kind of what this is. All right. These are just sort of the placement of the different chips on your motherboard that do different things. This takes care of your I/O, your input/output. This is called a bridged chip. This takes care of other devices on the board. You know, your controllers for your SATA drives. There's just a lot done on here that the CPU doesn't take care of. This is sort of like the bridge point from your CPU to all this other stuff on the board to handle that. All right, let's see. Yes, our PCI slots. So we have PCI. This is the old style PCI, been around for a long time. This is generally used for things like enhanced audio cards or maybe a TV tuner. I don't see PCI slots used very often in home systems or basic user systems. PCI Express 1. This is another type of PCI slot. This is more modern, and again, you'll only see things like enhanced audio cards in here. Maybe some specialized communication cards you'll see go in there, and they're very small. The slot's very small. This guy right here is your video card workhorse. This is where your video card would plug in. It's very, very fast. Your video card is really the only thing that goes in here, generally. And we'll take a look at that later, what the port actually looks like in the next pictures. And then the battery here, all this does is stores and saves the settings that you have in here. And it saves the time of the system. Basically, the really, really important stuff that your system needs to remember when it's off. So that's it for the drawing images I have here. Let's move on. So you should have a pretty good understanding now of what all of these devices look like. So you can see why I sort of started with the layout in a very basic drawing form. But these are what we just went over: the PS2 ports, HDMI, VGA, DVI, USB, audio. There's the chipset in the back. There's our LAN port. We have back here, that's where the CPU will sit. That's probably CPU fan port over there. Back here we've got the memory slots. There's the power plug back there. PCI 16, PCI 1, and then the normal PCI there, the old style PCI. And I won't go through all of these, but let's take a look at the next picture now, which has all of this except we're going to look at the board flat. And I'll try and zoom in a little bit here so we can see. So again, you know, same stuff. We're just looking at it from the top. There's our PCI slot. There's a PCI Express 1, PCI Express 3, 16-bit slot. There's our SATA connectors. See how these are pretty tough to see. You can see why I sort of, you know, showed you the line drawings, because it's hard to really see in there. But we went over all of that. Those look like USB connectors, COM port. Okay, there's power up here. There's our, remember how I was talking about the clips on the sides for the memory? You can see one clip sort of out right there. So you would take those two clips and push them out, and then you would take the memory and sort of, if you were looking at the board right now, you would take the memory and just push right into that slot. Pretty tough too. You got to really get that in there. And then sort of at the same time, you push in the memory, and then you take the clips and you close them to sort of lock it in place. That's the easiest way to describe it. All right. And then we've got our CPU power connector here. And that's pretty much it now for motherboards. You know, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave me some comments. You know, I went over as much as I could, really, just based on the imagery. Yeah, we'll talk about how to get the CPU installed, and you know, how to get this into the actual case and whatnot. It's getting it into the case is really easy. It's really just getting the motherboard to sit right with the panel in the back. All right. So thanks for watching. Again, please feel free to leave comments, and we'll move right on to the next lesson. In this video, we're going to be looking at how to install processors into motherboards. Specifically, we'll be looking at the processor that we've chosen and the motherboard that we've chosen for our example build. And you know, as you can see, we're looking at images here. We're not really going through a video of you know, showing somebody putting together a system. I feel that this is a little bit of a better format for learning, because it's a lot clearer to see the objects, and we can discuss things a bit more. All right, so what you're looking at right now is what's called a Fm2 Socket Processor. This is an AMD processor, and I'm showing you the most important part of this processor, and that's the bottom side. These are all pins that would connect into the motherboard so it can communicate with the components and everything that you do with a computer. One important thing to talk about here is handling of this processor. It's very important that these pins don't get bent, and they're very easy to bend, unfortunately. There are ways to bend the pins back if that does happen, but I will say that when handling these chips, the best thing to do is to handle them on the sides. So your thumb would be on this side, and your index finger would be on this side, and you would try your best not to touch the pins. And then when we actually drop this into a CPU slot, there's no pressure involved. We'll just drop the processor in. If it doesn't fall in, we take it out, check for bent pins, and try again. We never want to apply pressure to the CPU when we're dropping it into the slot. This goes for these types of processors that have pins. There are other types that do not have pins, and I'll show you what those are in this tutorial. But for all intents, this is the CPU that we've picked out for our build, so it will be the one that's discussed the most. The other important thing to look at here is this arrow up in the corner. This is telling you how to drop the CPU into the slot, you know, how to orient it. There's also an indicator on the motherboard itself that tells you how to drop it in. And again, it can only go in one way. If you try and force it, you can probably do it, but you're going to bend your pins and you're going to wreck your processor. Okay, so let's move on to our next photo here. And this is actually taken out of the motherboard manual, but I kind of wanted to go through it thoroughly so we know what we're trying to do here. So this particular socket is relatively simple. There are more complex ones that are have a little bit more parts to them and moving parts that we'll talk about. But this guy, all you're really doing is this little lever, this little bar right here is a pressure bar. So if you look down here when it's down, when you clip that in, you see down here where it clips, you have to apply pressure and then move that bar underneath the clip to make it lock in place. So this is showing you to lift the bar. This is where you drop the processor in. Now notice the triangle here. They're pointing you to where that triangle should point. That's very important. So when you're aligning your processor, that triangle needs to be in that corner. And again, when you're dropping this processor in, there should be no pressure at all. You should literally be able to hold it with one finger on this side and one finger on that side without touching the pins, and literally get it down to half an inch or even less than that above the socket and just drop it. If it doesn't drop in, pull it back up. You know, you could maybe shimmy it across to get the pins to match up, but I don't even recommend doing that. You know, just try and get it to drop in naturally using gravity. And then we take the bar and clip it in. And what this does is it moves this whole the whole socket across to get the contacts on the pins to touch the contacts that are on the motherboard. That's how that works. This next one we're actually going to go through in the next video. This involves putting thermal grease on the processor and putting on the heatsink and the fan. But we'll talk about that next. Let's take a look at our next slide here. This is an example of a socket FM2. The one on the board that we chose is actually black. There's no real difference between the two. It's just the color. But this is a visual representation. And you'll notice over here, here's the latch I was talking about. That bar has to go underneath that latch when the CPU is in to lock it in place. And here's that triangle we were talking about. Okay, so let's move on to the next one here. This is our motherboard that we chose. We went through this already in one of the other videos beforehand, but I just wanted you to see this is the processor, the CPU socket. There's the bar that we're talking about. Same exact thing. It's just a different color. Okay, and finally, this is actually a different type of CPU socket. I wanted to show this to you so you kind of can see the different types that are out there. It's the same kind of idea of taking the CPU and applying pressure with a bracket on top. So the way this one works, this is an Intel socket 1150. This is not an AMD socket. So the way this works is this bar, you would actually take this bar and you would press it down onto the board and then pull it outwards this way, and then the bar actually lifts up. And what that does is, it's kind of neat how this works. What it does is when you do that, it slides this metal piece, this big metal piece right here, over to the side, and what that does is it unlocks it from over here. And then what happens is this bar right here, see how it's raised like that, will actually take this entire metal piece and lift it up and away. And this, the way this socket works is these are actually all raised contacts that you can see here. This is different in that there are no pins on the processor, so you can handle them a little bit rougher than the AMD ones that we're looking at. But it's the same idea though. We want to just drop those into place without any pressure, and then if it looks even all the way around, then we take this bar, we bring the metal plate down, we get it lined up so it's going to slide underneath here, and then we take this bar, bring it down, and get it to latch underneath, and your CPU is installed. So that's it. Hopefully I didn't go too long in this video, but that's how to get your CPU installed into the socket, and that's your first step with your motherboard. You know, you should do this with the motherboard outside of your case. That's why the installation of the motherboard into the case is set later in this series, is because it's one of the easier things to get done when we're installing things, but before we get inside of the case. Once we have things in the case, it's a little bit harder to plug things in and move things around. So we're going to try and get as much done outside of the case. All right, so that's it for this video, and thank you for watching, and we will move on. In this section of our tutorial series here, we're going to look at how to install the heatsink and fan on the processor that we just installed. So in this first image we have up here is something called a heatsink compound, or it can also be called thermal grease, but basically what it is it's a material that goes in between the processor and the heatsink in order to dissipate heat and make sure that the heatsink is absorbing that heat away from the processor. So what you see right here is just an example, but you should actually get one of these with your processor. Whenever you purchase a processor, they generally give you a syringe of heatsink compounds to put on the processor. So we're going to go through those steps on how to do that. So we've looked at this image already. The reason I brought this up is because we actually want to take a look at the fourth diagram here, and it's simply telling you to apply the thermal grease onto the processor. And that's what we're going to do. Your processor should already be in the board, and once again, we're working on the board outside of the case. It's not in the case yet. But what you want to do, and there's a couple ways you can do this. Some people like to just put a drop in the middle and then just assume that when they put the heatsink down on the processor, that the pressure will make the thermal grease spread all around the CPU. I don't really like to do it that way for a couple reasons. Number one, if there's too much thermal grease, then what's going to happen is it's going to spill on the sides of the processor here, and I don't really think that's a nice, clean way to do it. What I've done for years, and once again, this is totally up to you if you want to do it this way. I actually take the syringe of the thermal grease, and I do about 3 small lines, very very small lines of thermal grease across the processor. And then what I do is I actually take an old credit card. And the reason for that is the credit card has a nice, clean, bendable edge that will allow you to spread the compound very, very smoothly across the top of the chip. And that's really your goal. You want to have the entire chip covered. You don't want to have too much goop on there. And you want it to have a very thin, perfectly covered layer. So you use the edge of the credit card and you spread out the thermal grease on the processor. If you get some on the sides, you wipe that off. You just want to have the very top of the processor covered. All right, so that's my recommendation. Again, there's a number of ways to do it, but your goal is to completely cover the processor and not have a mess around it when you install the heatsink and fan. So let's move on to actually that step. This is the fan that may or may not come with the processor that we're looking at right now. It will be very similar. It's the same kind of concept if it's not this exact one. But what we're looking at here is the heatsink and fan combo that would come with a processor. And if you look at these clips on the side, and we're going to look at the diagram of how this goes onto the CPU, but I want you to see a real picture of this so I can sort of go over the different parts. This little clip right here, what this does is it actually attaches onto the sides of the CPU slot base. It holds it down onto the motherboard. So think of it as it's pulling up the CPU socket but pushing down on the CPU. And in that way, you're getting as much pressure as you can to have it right there on the CPU. Okay, but the way this works is when you have these clips connected, there's one on the other side too. When you have these clips connected to the motherboard, when you flip this lever, it's basically just takes the whole thing and tightens it right to the motherboard, right on top of the CPU. All right, so let's take a look at. Before I move ahead, this is the power cable here. This will attach to your motherboard. It is possible to attach it directly to a power supply plug, but I recommend not doing that because the motherboard has some settings and software running, so it can monitor the temperature of your CPU, it can monitor the fan speed, it can alert you when the fan's not spinning, which is very important because your CPU will burn out or your system will start shutting down. But this is the guy that's going to plug into the motherboard, and we'll take a look at that a little bit more deeply in a little bit. And this is obviously the fan. That's the thing that we want to keep spinning. Okay, and this is like a radiator type heatsink here. This is designed to dissipate the heat that comes up from the processor, and then the fan. What the fan does is actually it blows in, so it's blowing fresh air down and through this radiator here. You would think it blows up, but the reason it doesn't do that is because if it were to blow air upwards, then it's pulling heat off of the motherboard as well. It's not really cooling the metal. We're trying to cool the metal with fresh air, so that's why it blows down. All right, so let's take a look at the next picture I got. Here's the diagram that we're going to use. This is actually straight out of the motherboard manual, and this is your processor. Obviously, you should already have your thermal grease applied on there. These are the hooks that I was talking about on the sides. And what you're trying to do is get the heatsink and fan to hook into those on the side and clamp down to the board. So this is showing you, the movement to get the CPU's heatsink and fan down into the board. But what you're really looking at are these guys, where see the little arrow up there showing you where to stick the clip. So it's a little tricky, but if you notice on this one, there's actually no lever that you're moving here on this side. So the way I like to do it actually is I do this side first. I get the clip hooked into the plastic piece, and then I do the other side and get that piece connected as well. And then once you have both sides secured, it'll be a little wobbly because it's not actually secured to the board. This is where this little guy comes in, this lever here. This will tighten the entire assembly down to the board. And then in which case your installation is done and you can plug the power cable that we were looking at here, that power cable, into the board. And now you've installed your CPU heatsink assembly. So that's pretty much it. I do have one photo left in here, and that is the board that we've been looking at. This is the board that we've been using as an example. So if you look, let's see, I think it's over here. I think that's the CPU fan power. It's kind of tricky. The resolution isn't so great here. But anyway, you'll see it marked very clearly. It'll say CPU fan. It might even be this over here. It'll be 4 pins like that. Okay, I'm pretty sure it's this guy. So make sure that we're hooking up to the right plug here. But I'm sure it'll be pretty easy to figure out. Okay, and that's it. So that is heatsink installation on your CPU. Next up, we're going to take a look at how to install RAM, which is actually very simple. It should be a pretty short video. But thank you for watching, and we will move on. In this video, we're going to look at how to install memory in our motherboard. So right now, we should have our motherboard still outside of the case. We've been installing the processor and the heatsink, and now we're going to install the memory, and it's a pretty quick process. I'm going to go over it in a little bit of detail just so we can sort of make sure we catch any questions along the way. So on your motherboard, this picture is actually taken right out of the motherboard manual. This is an example of the memory slot that's on the board. It's just drawn in a way to make it clear to see. It's really, really easy to do. All you need to do is pull these tabs back on the memory slot, and then take the card or the memory stick and push it down into the slot and make sure that the notch is the right way. So the notch can only go in one direction. Here's the memory that we're using. You see the notch here? It can only go in one direction in the slot. So if it feels like it shouldn't be there, it should be pretty obvious. Some of the older sticks had the notch fairly close to the middle, so sometimes you couldn't really tell. But these are pretty easy to tell where they should go. And I've said this before, but once you press the memory stick, you would actually press from the top here. Your thumb is best to be pushing down on the stick from the top once it's in the slot a little bit. And then you take your other fingers and take these clips on the sides and sort of push down with your thumb and push the clips in so it locks in place. And you'll know that it's locked in place. Sometimes it takes a good deal of pressure to get it in there. Don't be shy about it, but you'll feel it click in. Those should be fully in place as it shows down here. And you shouldn't see much of the contacts once it's in. So if we look at the other picture here, like these contacts along the edge here, once it's in the slot, should not really be that visible. You might see a little bit. If you see, say, 90% of it, then it's not in the slot completely, and you should try again. Okay, so some of the other photos I grabbed here were close-ups of the board that we're using. So here are the clips on the sides. Here's one that's actually open. I actually, when I install RAM, I do it maybe a bit differently than some other people do it. But what I actually do is I have that clip out like that, and then I take one edge and sort of jam it in there so I know it's secure, and then I sort of take the chip and slide it down into the other one. This would be open. You can do it that way, or you can do it like how I said before, where you take the whole thing and you just try to get all in completely at once. So what really matters is that these clips are closed like that, and that you don't see the contacts here on the bottom, and that you really feel that it's snug and in place. Okay, so I do have one more picture here, and it's really just the top view. So if you were looking down at the board and it was on your table, you would be pushing down on the top of the memory stick with your thumbs, and then closing these clips on the side to complete the job. So that's it. Like I said, pretty quick. It's a pretty quick process to get memory installed, and we'll move on to the next video in our series. Welcome back, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at how we can install a power supply into the case that we picked out for our first build. So as I've said before, we're doing this in a sort of lecture/presentation format. So you won't see me actually putting a system together, but rather I'm going to be using images that are clear to see in order to sort of really explain each part in detail without, the issue of lighting and, camera movement and all that stuff. When you're done with the course, we should have a thorough understanding of how all the pieces go together without actually doing any kind of hand-holding and showing how to do it in a video. I like to be able to teach you about the different components and have you be able to put it together, with some confidence on your own. So that's how we're doing these videos. So in the first video here, or rather the first picture here, we're looking at the case that we chose. This is one side open on this case. There's actually two panels. There's one in the back here, and the one in the front panel where you have access to most of the components that you would put into the system. I would actually recommend taking the back panel off as well, because we're actually going to be passing in some cables to the other side of this plate that you'll be using to connect to your to the motherboard once we install that. Okay, so we'll be referring back to this image quite often in this video. All right, so if we look down the bottom here, this is where we're going to be installing the power supply. In the next picture here, this is the view of where the power supply would go. So it's basically just, we're looking at the back side here of the case. We're looking in from the back side in this picture. This is a really good photo of where the power supply is going to go. We'll be using 4 screws, 1 in each corner. This case comes with a whole bunch of stuff. You know, we've got some cable management ties. These will be really useful to sort of bundle things up and get them out of the way. This is your bag of miscellaneous screws, and this is the speaker that you would connect to the motherboard. A lot of times, if the system boots when you're done putting it together, you don't necessarily need this. Speakers are meant for trying to figure out issues that are going on with the motherboard once it's in. Like if it doesn't start, it'll beep at you with some error codes. So you could go ahead and put that in if you want once we get to the motherboard part of this, but I don't really think it's necessary. All right, so let's go back up here. So this is where we're going to be putting the power supply. Here's the power supply we've chosen, sort of laid out so you can see what all the cables are. In this build, we're only going to have the hard drive and the DVD burner. So besides the cables that come out of this power supply by default, which are for the motherboard, these are power cables for the motherboard, we're going to only want 2 power cables for our devices. So there are different types of power cables. There's a Molex power, which is this guy right here. It's kind of hard to tell. You'll know right away when you're looking at your devices which is a Molex power connector and which is a SATA power connector. We're going to be using SATA power connectors, and those are these guys right here. All right, so we're going to be plugging in 2 SATA. Actually, one of these cables probably has 2 SATA cables or connectors on it. So you actually may only need 1 cable to plug into this power supply. The important thing is we want to have as many power connectors as we need for the devices we want. And at this time, all we need are 2 SATA power connectors. Okay, so you could absolutely take this connector and connect it right now before we put it in the case, but there's enough room in this case where you could actually pop that in when we're ready to sort of route the cables through the case and through the grommets that are in the case. Okay, so here's the power supply without anything, any cables or whatever, and we're actually going to be installing it this way, and I'll show you why. If we take a look at the case again, this case has the fan grill on the bottom for the power supply, and I actually like this design because what this does is it prevents the power supply from having to deal with all of the heat coming from your system. It has its own air intake, which would be actually underneath the case, and then it blows out the back of the power supply any heat that's has been sort of gathering up inside of the power supply. And then the other components in the system have their own sort of cooling mechanism. We got a fan up here, that we can pull the hot air out from. Okay, so they're separated, which I like. Okay, let's see. So this is what it's going to look like from the inside of the case once we get it in there, and this is what it's going to look like from the outside. So if we take a look at a motherboard, or rather a system that's completely done here, you can see here, this is a different power supply, but here's our power supply at the bottom. All right, and you can see the cables there that are routed through the back side of the chassis here. And they do that to keep it nice and clean. We don't really want a lot of cables in this area here. We want to keep it nice and clean. So you notice that here's a hard drive, and they power the hard drive by routing the power cables to the back of the case and then to the back of the hard drive, which is where the connectors would be. So there's no actual messy cables on the front side here. And then if we take a look at the back side, this is what it would look like on the back side as an example. So there's the hard drive, there's the power connector, and the SATA connector connected to it. So that looks nice and clean. Now, what I do kind of want to talk about is the types of screws involved. And it's kind of hard to see in this particular user's guide for this case, but I'm going to go through it anyway. If we go over here to, let me see if I can zoom in a little bit because the type is kind of hard to read. So here's the cable ties we were talking about right there. These are standoffs for the motherboard. We'll talk about that when we actually put the motherboard into the system. These are very much required. We have to put those in or else the motherboard will short out. And then if you look here, there are 4 6-pound, I don't know what that actually means, 6-pound -32. And the interesting thing is we have, the same type of screw here, right? And it's a round edge, and then this one is not a round edge. So I'm not sure what the actual difference is here. All right, but the one that has the edges there is what you want to use for the power supply. It'll be pretty obvious in the bag of screws which ones they are, because the rest of them that are in the bag have a rounded edge. Okay, so that's what you want to use. If we go back to, there's the power supply opening. You would be looking at this from this side. You would slide the power supply in here and take 4 of those screws, and it should line right up. Make sure the power supply is upside down and the fan is sticking out the bottom. And once you have that in there, it should be a piece of cake to get that installed. I think that's it. The power supply is really easy to install, in my opinion. It's one of the easier components anyway. And hopefully you have enough information without going through a real video of putting a power supply in, that you can sort of use your own knowledge now to really install any kind of power supply in any system. It's really basic. You just have to match the profile size of the power supply with the case. So this would be an ATX power supply for an ATX case. And really, that's all you need to know, besides the different connectors that you need for the components in the system, as well as the wattage required for the hardware, and to make sure you have enough power. All right, so that's it. Thank you for watching, and we'll move on to the next video. In this video, in our series, we're going to actually be putting our motherboard into the case that we've purchased for this build. So this is probably going to span a couple of videos, I imagine. There's a lot to this. There's a lot of different steps. There's cables we have to connect. There's things I need to explain about where those cables get connected, because they're can be a little confusing. So bear with me, and we'll take it a step at a time, and we'll go as slow as we need to in order to make sure that we cover everything. Okay. So first up, we have our motherboard, we have our case, we have our CPU and CPU fan and heatsink all installed on the motherboard. We've got the RAM on the motherboard as well. So, if we go to the motherboard here, obviously we have those components I just talked about installed already. You can actually hold on to the motherboard by the CPU heatsink and fan, because they're very, very solid, very well held to the motherboard and very secure. I've done that for years. But if you don't think that that's safe for the CPU and the motherboard, you can absolutely hold the motherboard from its sides when installing it into the case. So let's talk about that right now. The first thing that we need to do for this case actually is we need to install what's called a I/O panel, which goes into this sort of slot right here. And what that does is it allows the motherboard to stick out the back and allow access to all of the ports that you would see here. Without the panel, all of this would be exposed, and you would have holes and things could sort of fall into the motherboard area, which we really don't want that to happen. And installing the I/O panel is relatively simple. It's a luck shot as to whether or not it's easy to install into the case. But if you take a look at this panel, you'll see a metal sort of lip or indentation here, and that's the part that you actually want to push into the case from the inside to the outside. So in other words, let's say we're looking at the case here. Okay, we're looking at this case from the outside. We actually want to be on the inside of the case when we do this. So I don't have a really good example here, I don't think, but let's see. We'll go back to this one. So you'll see here, a little bit of light coming in the back here in this example. So we're going to be actually looking at the case this way. We're going to take that panel and we're going to install it and sort of push it into that back space area where that slot is. And you'll want to line up how this I/O panel is supposed to line up to the motherboard. So let's take a look here. We have the 3 audio jacks here on the right, and then we have the keyboard and mouse over here on the left. So if you look at the motherboard, there's the keyboard and mouse, old style PS2 style ports, and then we have the audio plugs on this side. So that's pretty obvious, right? You want the panel to look exactly like that when you sort of tap it into inside the case here. And again, you want to go from inside to outside. It's very easy to make the mistake of trying to put the panel in from the outside to the inside, because it looks like it would be a lot easier to do that. But you want to go from the inside to the outside, and you'll know once you tap that I/O panel in, you'll know when it's secure, and you'll know when it's flush and where it's supposed to be. Okay, so we've got that done. We've got the panel in there. Now comes the hard part, and that's actually installing the motherboard into the case. So once again, we do have one more step we have to do before we do that, and it's very important. So let's take a look at the case here. This is a really good. This is probably the best picture of this case I've seen. It's very easy to see all of the screws. Where we want the screws to be in this case. So first thing we need to do actually is look at the motherboard. So if we take a look at this motherboard, there should be 6 screw holes where we would mount this motherboard. Okay, so let's take a look here. Here's one here. Now usually what you'll see is motherboard manufacturers try to put more screw holes closer to the PCI Express slot. And the reason for that is because the cards that go into the slot are generally very big and very heavy and have a lot to them. So you want to have as much support as you can. So you'll actually see here, there's a mount spot here, there's a mount spot there, here, and here as well. So there's 4 mount spots just for this area, which makes sense. And if you look at the case for those mount spots, right, so I know these sizes pretty well, so I can point them out. I know there's a lot of holes here, and that's for the different sizes of motherboards. There's ATX full-size motherboards, which would span this entire space right here, where you see all those screws. And you know, by the time you get to this part of the tutorial, you should have you should have the power supply already mounted in here. And I did forget to say one thing in that video, and that is once you have the power supply in there, you actually want to take your cables and actually spit them out the back here and get them out of the way for now. When we need the cables, we're going to actually pull them in through these other grommets here, and we'll pull them in and plug them in where we need to. So those cables need to go out to get them out of the way. All right, so the mount points that we're going to use in this case, so it's a smaller board, but you'll see if you take a look at these two mount points here and these two mount points here, these are, you see these slots here, these are the slots for a card. We're not going to have a card for our build, but that's where the card would be. So I know that's where that's going to line up. Take a look at the board as well. So there's one slot, there's another slot, and there's the four points. Now on the other end, you'll notice that there isn't a lot of, actually there's no mount points on the rest of the board except for up here. So there's two up here in the corners. So if you go back to the case, that'll be this guy and this guy. All right, and you'll be able to tell by, you can just look straight down the line here. They're right above each other. Oops, let's go back here. Yeah, right above each other here. So if you go back to the motherboard and you look at the mount point, 1, 2, go straight up, and there's the third one. So it's very easy to tell where your board is going to mount. And that's important because we don't want to, our next step is to put mount points into the casing. And when I say mount points, what I actually mean are these copper standoffs. So you should get a bunch of copper standoffs with your case. We're going to use those copper standoffs in order to mount the motherboard in the case where it's supposed to be. So in this case, we're going to use 6. You should have 10, we're going to use 6. So if you go back to the case, you want to take those mounting screws, or the heck are they called? I always forget. Copper standoffs. You're going to take those copper standoffs, and we'll go back to the case here, and you're going to put 6 in. One here, one here, one here, one here, one here, and one here. Now, it is possible, I can't really tell by this picture, but it is possible that some of these you may not be able to screw in a standoff. That's okay. You know, 1 or 2 that are missing or you can't put a screw into, that's fine, especially since we're not going to be installing any cards. But there shouldn't be too many missing because that can cause problems, especially if the board itself is malleable and you can bend it. You know, when plugging things in, you can actually short out the board because the board will bend and then touch the case, and then who knows what happens at that point. So we've got the copper mounts in there, and you know, we've got the motherboard ready to put in the case. We've got the I/O panel installed on the back side here. Okay. Now we want to actually get the motherboard into the case, and this can be a little tricky, and I'll tell you why. If we take a look at the motherboard here, you'll notice up here where the PS2 plugs are, you see this little metal sort of bracket or spring. What that is actually, it's kind of like a pressure point where, or like a spring point, where once you have the motherboard in the case, you would take your fingers and sort of push on this side to get the motherboard to slide forward to where the I/O panel would sort of plug into these plugs. So I'll take a look here as well. There's the spring there as well. And really what we're trying to do is we're trying to get all of these ports to be flush with the I/O panel that we've installed in the back. Okay? So you'll see here that there are little metal sort of springy pieces. And you want to make sure that those line up very, very well with the ports on the motherboard. It's honestly, it's a very cheap component. I really wish that manufacturers would do something about these particular I/O panels. They are a bit better with really expensive boards, but for the most part, manufacturers don't spend a lot of time on this part. So you just sort of kind of have to work with it. You see the little metal pieces there. Your goal is to not have any of the ports be blocked by these little metal spring pieces here. That's really the goal. You want to have this I/O panel flush to the back of the case, and then you want to have the motherboard ports flush to this I/O panel as well. And one way you can tell you've really accomplished that is once you have the copper standoffs in place in the case, and you've got your motherboard, you sort of, you're looking at the case on a table. This case is laid down on the table. You're looking down at it, and you're dropping the motherboard inside this case, and then you're sort of shimmying it over to the left to get it to line up all of its ports with the I/O panel on the back. And really, the way to tell that you've done a good job is, with the pressure that you're putting on the board from this side to sort of hold the spring in place, these copper standoff points, you should be able to actually see them now right through the holes on the motherboard. So if you see these mount points, this is where you're going to put the screws in, right? These 6 mount points. When you're holding this motherboard with your hand to compress it against the back of the I/O panel in the back with this spring here, everything should feel good and look good, and you should be able to see the copper standoff screws right through these mount points. Okay, and you might have to do it a couple times. I know even in my experience, there have been some times where I'll actually get these metal little spring points or pressure points. I'll actually get them to block the port when I'm done installing it. So I'll have to take the motherboard out, bend the pins to where they should be, and then install the motherboard again and make sure none of those ports are being blocked by any metal pieces. There'll be a little bit of trial and error, I'll tell you that right now. But don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. It's just, once you get it in there, you'll know, and then you'll be done, and we can move on to the next part of this. So we've got the motherboard in. We've got it, shimmied up against the I/O panel. You can see the standoff screws right through the holes on the board. So obviously the next part is going to be screwing it down so it doesn't move anymore. So we can get it into place. And the screws that you're going to use are these M3 screws. There's a whole bunch of them that you should have received with this case. If you look at the screw itself, you see it has sort of a lip on the outside edge. That's really to get the board to be flattened down and to not have a bunch of overhead with the screw when it's screwed into the board. So we'll get those screws. We'll screw those into the board right here. It should be shimmied against the I/O panel. You should be able to see, once again, the copper standoffs. And what I usually do is, for the first couple of screws, I'll actually hold the motherboard in place on this edge, so it's compressed to the side, and that I can see the holes through, or I can see through the holes to the copper standoffs. And then I'll use an electric screwdriver to get 2 screws in from the top and the bottom. That way you have some support, then you can let go, and then you can screw in the remaining screws to hold down the board, right? And there you go. You've got your motherboard installed, you've got your CPU installed, you've got the fan and the heatsink, and you've got the memory sticks. So we're making some pretty good progress here. And the next parts of this particular video is showing you how to connect up the cables into from the case and the power supply to this motherboard. It's a little bit tricky, but like I said, we'll take it slow to make sure we capture all that we need to get this done. Alrighty, so let's start with the power supply. Now, you may have got all of these parts, specifically to sort of go along with this tutorial, and that's great. I'm glad that you did that. You'll notice here that this particular power supply, we've got the 24-pin ATX or EATX plug here for our motherboard. So we go back to the motherboard. Here is our 24-pin plug here. But there is also something called a CPU power connector, and that's up here, and that's 4-pin. And then you're looking at the power supply and saying to yourself, well, the only other plug here that would work really is this 8-pin power supply. And that's, don't freak out. What that actually is for other boards that have 8-pin, sort of an extended power plug. And all you actually have to do with this particular power supply is, you'll see here, let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. You'll see here there's almost like a little pin or like a latch here. And you'll see it on here too. These actually break off. This will split into two 4-pin plugs. And this will actually split off into a 20-pin and a 4-pin. And that's for backwards compatibility for older systems. So you're going to actually take this, the 4-pin plug and plug it into this port. Now, one thing you'll have to note here, and it's too bad the resolution isn't that great, but these plugs are keyed. So in other words, they can only go in a certain way. Actually, if you look down here, it might be a little easier to see. You see how this one has sort of like almost looks like a little house. If you look at it look at it from the side, and this one is square. So these are kind of like that too. They can only go in one way, but they do need to go in. So you're going to split that apart and figure out how to get one of those plugs to plug in here without any force. It needs to go in relatively easy. Even though they're keyed, you can force them, and obviously we don't want to do that. We'll blow out our board. All right, so let me back up a little bit here, and let's go back to the case. And what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how we should accomplish getting those power plugs plugged in. And like I said before, we don't want a lot of messiness on this side of this case. We don't want a lot of cables sort of floating around. This is where your motherboard is going to be. This is where your drive is going to be. This is your power supply, and we're going to have a DVD drive up here. So your power supply has been installed here. I mentioned that we're going to fish the cables throughout the back here, and then we're going to fish them in when we need them. And right now, we need the 24-pin power cable for the motherboard, and we need the 4-pin power cable for the motherboard as well. And what you're going to do is you're going to actually take that 24-pin and fish it out here back into the case. Okay? And then once it's in the case, you're going to plug it in right here on the 24-pin ATX power connector. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. I rotated this so it makes it a little bit easier to understand, what we're looking at. Here's the case, and here's the motherboard, and that's how it's going to look inside the motherboard. Obviously, with the CPU and the heatsink and the fan and whatnot in the memory. So we've got the ATX connector plugged in, and now I don't believe there's any grommets up the top here where you could fish in the cable. So I would recommend probably fishing in the 4-pin cable through here, and then bring it over to, it's going to be right about here is where the 4-pin power connector needs to be plugged in, and that's where you're going to plug in that connector. Okay, so now your motherboard has power from the power supply, and we've got both power connectors installed on there. That's awesome. So before I forget, probably the next thing we want to do, since we're talking about power, is we want to actually get, I know you can't see it here, but there is, we have your CPU and your fan and your heatsink on here, okay? And coming from that fan is going to be a power plug to so the fan is spinning. We want that fan to have power, or else your CPU is going to overheat pretty much immediately. Okay, so I believe that plug is here, but let's double check. Let's go down to, here we go. Yep, that looks like that's the one we want. So here's the CPU fan. It's a 4-pin plug that we want. So if we go back up to our motherboard here, you're going to take the plug that's coming out of your fan and you're going to plug it in there. And there's a few things you can do to make sure that plug doesn't or rather the cable from that plug doesn't interfere with things in your case, like the CPU fan. I've taken like wire ties, like these guys. Yeah, I've taken wire ties like these and sort of taken the cable that's coming, the power cable that's coming off of the CPU fan, and wrapped it up as tight as I could, so it doesn't have a lot of movement and won't sort of run into things in the case. But that's totally up to you. I like to keep things neat inside of the case. Okay, so we've got our motherboard installed. We've got the fan powered. Now we're going to look at connecting the case components, or the case plugs and adapters and like the headphones and the power light and the hard drive light and all that. We're going to look at how that's done, and this is a little bit tricky. Unfortunately, this case doesn't come with a standard, a complete plug that has all the plugs kind of combined. It separates them into a whole bunch of plugs. So here's one example. There's a power switch plug, hard drive light, power light, and reset switch. So I had hoped that this case would come with, a front side case connector that kind of looked like these, but it doesn't. That's unfortunate, but that's okay. We can work with that. So this is the interface in the front of the case that we want to connect to, and I think we're actually going to be able to have all of these work. There are some times cases will be really advanced and expandable, and you'll find that the motherboard that you might purchase for it doesn't have all of the plugs on the board that you need to make them work. But in this case, we actually do. All of these should work by the time we're done with this. Okay, so let's take a look at the cables. The more complicated cables we're going to look at first, and that's these guys. All right, so we have two switches, a power switch and a reset switch. And you'll notice that there's no minus or plus, no ground on those. And that's because all they simply do is perform a short on the motherboard. So there's all it really does is close a circuit. Okay, so you can actually install those any way you want. Backwards or forwards, it doesn't matter. It just closes a loop in a circuit. But the LEDs are a separate matter. And I'm going to show you how to make sure that we're plugging those in the right way. And it's a little tricky, but if we look at the motherboard, here is the plug here. Now, there might be some printing there where you can see kind of how the plugs are going to go in, But a lot of times that printing is so small, it's very hard to read, and it's not aligned right, etc., etc. So we're actually going to go look at the motherboard, and I've actually cut out the one chart that we need to get this done, and it's the F panel. They call it the F panel, and like I said, they've some cases have taken this and standardized it, so this is all just one plug, like the USB plugs. But unfortunately, in this particular case, we have to do it the hard way and get these installed one by one. Okay, so this is exactly how it looks on the board, and this is the exact layout as well. So as a for instance, let's say we wanted to start with the power LED, and that's the first two pins on the left. And the first pin is the positive pin. So you're going to take that plug, which is here. So you're going to take this positive pin, the power LED pin, right? And you're going to plug it into that first top left pin on the board. So here's a little bit better. Let's get back there. Here's a little bit better rendition of it. See there's the F panel, and you're gonna take that plug and you're gonna plug it into this first pin right here. And then obviously the next pin would be the ground pin for that LED. So that's not too bad, right? And then we just continue on. The next thing in that in this panel is the power and the ground. So again, it doesn't really matter which way you plug this particular one in, because there's no positive and no ground. You can just plug it into those two, the next two. So we'll go back to this one. It's these two guys right here. Zoom in, make sure you can see this. It's these two guys right here. It's not going to work. Yeah. So 1, 2. It's 3 and 4 in that pin array, and that's going to be the power switch here. Okay, so you're just going to plug those into 3 and 4 in this array here. All right. So now that we know how to plug in LEDs and switches, the rest is going to be pretty easy. So hard drive LED is the same way. It's just the bottom pins here is what we're going to use. So we'll go back to here, and we're going to take the hard drive LED, plus and minus. Now notice that how this one is combined, but that one isn't. And that's really, there's no real reason for that except for backwards compatibility. It's most often you'll find the hard drive LED to be together like that on the board, but some older boards have the power LED, in the pins in disparate locations on the board, which is odd, which is why they've separated this like this. Okay. So plus and minus. Minus is going to be black. Plus is going to be white. Go back to the diagram here. So plus is white. Minus is black. So the black side is going to be over here where it says HDD LED minus. All right. So that's done. And the next one is a reset switch, and that's as simple as plugging in the reset switch, which is this guy here, to these here, 3 and 4 on the bottom. All right, and the last pin is NC, which I believe means it's not used, no connection or something like that. I don't know, but that's it. Those are the pins we're going to use there, and you've got the LEDs, the power switch, and the reset switch done. The last cables that we're looking at for that, for the case, are these guys, which is a lot easier. We've got the audio plug, we've got the USB plug. This is probably another USB plug, I'm not sure, and then USB 3. Okay, so let's go back to the diagram. All right, and we're looking at USB 3, that's the bottom here. That's where that big blue cable would plug in. There's the two USB plugs you could use. They only go in one way, so I'm not really going to explain too much about it. Same as that, you see there's a missing pin here, so they can only go in one way, and the audio jack or the audio plug goes in here. So all those plugs will plug in very easily at the bottom of the board. Okay, now if we take a look at the case and where those plugs will be plugged into, you'll notice here that there's a couple of grommets here that we might be able to use to route those cables through. So you'll notice that a lot of these are on the bottom of the board. We want those cables to connect to the board without having them sort of laid all over the place on this side of this case. So we're going to actually take those cables, and we're actually going to pull them through here. Now, before I get too far ahead of myself, those cables are coming from up here, okay? And all of those cables, what we want to actually do is we're going to actually route them through this grommet here to the other side of the case. And then they'll run down the back side here, and we're going to pull them through these two grommets and then plug them in where they need to be plugged in. Now, those individual plugs, the smaller plugs, you might want to pull them through this grommet here, and that's fine. The goal is that we don't want to have so many cables all laid out on this side of the board. It gets really messy. And you can use the wire ties that come with the case to sort of neaten things up once we're done as well. I definitely like to do that. All right, we are almost done. We've got the motherboard in place, we've got the CPU, we've got the fan, we've got the memory, we've got power, we've got all of the case components and the plugs connected to the board as well. That's awesome. Let's take a look and see if there's anything else that we may be missing. I don't believe there is. I think we're about done. So, you know, if I'm missing anything, we'll sort of figure that out in another video when I think of it. But you are about 90% done with putting together your system. So in our future videos, we're going to be looking at how to install drives and to get them cabled, and then, you know, we should be able to boot the system. You know, we're almost done here. We've got pretty much everything installed. And like I said, if you've had any kind of issues along the way, if you've had questions, I'm very happy to answer questions. I love it when my students ask me questions. Please feel free to let me know. You know, any thoughts or problems you're having along the way, and I'm happy to answer as quickly as I can. Okay, so thank you for watching, and we'll move on to our next video. In this video, we're going to be installing our drives that we've purchased for our first build here. So this part should be pretty easy. We've already got the power supply installed. We've got the cables running out the back. We've got the power supply connected to the motherboard. The motherboard is installed. And really, we just need to get some drives installed so we can start installing some software and, you know, loading our drives with data. So the first thing we need to do, we're gonna actually start with the DVD drive, which is going to be up at the top here, the top of the case. You'll notice here that there's in this picture there's a missing latch here. These latches are designed to allow you to install drives without needing any tools, basically. But I'm fairly certain that if we take a look at one of the other pictures here, like here's one, there should be 3 latches up there. So we should have no problem with using the top bay for our first drive. That said, you know, if you really wanted to, it would be no problem to use, you know, the second drive down here. So if we take a look at the front of the case, if we use the first drive bay, your drive is going to show up here in the first driveway. If we drop it down one, well, our CD drive or DVD drive will show up here, which will look kind of weird, but it's totally up to you. The other thing we have to think about as well is that we have some cables. You can't see it in this picture, but we have, for our buttons and our plugs and you know, the power button, the reset button, and the USB plugs up at the top here, we've got some cables that are running along the inside here and out this grommet. Depending on how tight that is, you may or may not want to have your DVD drive up here. But I'm not sure what the amount of room there is available up above the drive. Most likely it's okay. You would install the drive. It would probably butt out a little bit here, and then your cables from the interface at the top here would run down the back of your drive and then into the grommet space, and then you would pull them out wherever they're needed on the motherboard. So one thing that we need to do in order to get to the drive bays is we need to pull this front panel off. Now there's two ways we can do this. The front panel, these drive bay panels are very, very easy to remove. You can remove this entire front panel and then remove the drive bays once you have the panel off. Or you can do what I like to do and stick your hand inside here. There's plenty of space in here. Stick your hand inside here and towards the top drive bay cover, and you can literally just sort of kick that drive bay cover out, and you don't even need to remove that front panel. There's no other real reason to remove the front panel. And to me, it's a little bit easier to do it that way instead of having to remove the front panel completely. The front panel can be removed. There should be, if you look inside along the length of the metal lip here on the inside, there should be little plastic pieces of this front panel that are sort of sticking through the metal. You can just push on those to get the front panel to come out. In the instructions for this case, they actually ask you to pull on the bottom first and then pull on the top to get the front panel out. But like I said, I don't think that's necessary. You can probably accomplish the same task by just sticking your hand inside and poking out that first bay cover. All right, so once that bay cover is out, we can take a look at the drive itself that we're installing. This is the DVD burner that we picked out. And it's really, really, really easy to get this guy in. There are screw holes, but the case that we have is a screwless case. So we don't need to deal with finding screws that will fit into this guy. All you really need to do is slide it right into that top bay, unlatch these latches that are on the side, this top latch here, slide it in, and then you'll have to sort of line up where the screw holes in the drive to the little, I don't know what you would call them, the pokers on the latches to get it to latch into place. That's all it does. Is it literally just sticks a couple of pieces of plastic into the screw holes on the side of the drive to hold it in place. Okay, so once that's done, our next step is to connect that drive to the motherboard and to give it power. So in our previous videos, we've installed the motherboard, we've installed the power supply, so they're ready for us to connect to in this case. The first thing we need to look at is we want to make sure that we have the right power cable for this drive. So I cut out a little picture here. This is actually from the power supply images. If you look at this cable, this has 3 power connectors for 3 SATA drives. That's awesome. The only issue we have with this is our hard drive, which is an SSD in this case, is going to be in a totally different area in the case. So we're actually going to need 2 cables that have SATA power connectors. And if you look at these connectors here, they're sort of keyed, so they can only go in one way, and they're flat, what you want to do is find 2 of these in the cables that you received with the power supply. And then once you find 2 cables that have a SATA power connector on them, and it's fine if they have something else on them as well, you'll find that some of the power connectors will have both the old style Molex connector and a SATA power connector. That's fine. We can still use the SATA power connector to get power to our drives. So we want 2 of these, and we want them connected to the power supply, obviously. If we go back up here to this image that we keep going back to, our power supply is installed here, and if you haven't connected any SATA power connectors or cables to this yet, this is the time to do so. And you would literally just take the end that's obvious that goes into the power supply and plug those in. So the longer one that you choose, we want to take the longer one and have it go right up inside this grommet, so it's routed to the back of the case. And then we're gonna route it up to the top here, and then pull it out here at the top grommet, and then connect it to our drive. And let me show you the back of the drive so we know what we're looking at here. This is an extreme close-up of the back of the drive, and you'll notice that it's keyed. So the SATA power connector can only go in one way, so that should make that relatively easy. And once that's in place, we want to connect the SATA data cables. So let's go back to the motherboard here. If we look down at the bottom of the motherboard, we have 6 SATA connections. That's actually really, really good for a motherboard. Generally, you only see 2 or 4, so that's pretty decent. So we're going to want to take a SATA cable, which you should have received a couple of them with this motherboard. And I will say that sometimes the SATA cables that you receive can tend to be short. This may be a case where the SATA cable is too short for this case. They're really, really cheap if you wanted to buy some extra ones on Newegg. That shouldn't be an issue. Hopefully we don't have to do that, but just in case, if you haven't purchased the hardware for this build that we're doing, I would go ahead and throw in a couple extra SATA cables just in case. I actually like to keep a few on hand, for future builds or whatever. So we're going to connect one of our SATA cables to any one of these ports. They are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 if you take a look at the motherboard layout, but it doesn't really matter where you connect them. And then, actually, let me show you a picture of the SATA cables just in case. This is taken directly from the motherboard instruction material. These are 2 SATA cables that come with your motherboard. So we're going to use both of those. So we want to connect one end here, and then what we're going to do is we're going to, once again, the motherboard is sitting right about here. It stops right about here. So you notice we have a few more grommets we can use here to pass through the SATA cable to our drives. So what I would do is that the SATA ports should be right around here. So I think they're close enough to this grommet over here where we can run that SATA cable over here, out the grommet, up the back here, pull it back in, and then plug it right into our drive. And once that's done, our DVD drive is ready to go. It's installed, and we are done with that part of this tutorial. So, next on the list is our fancy SSD, our lightning fast SSD. So let's take a look at what we're going to do with that. This is the bottom of the SSD that we've chosen, and the reason I'm showing you this is to show you the SATA power and data connectors. But when we're installing it into the case, It's actually going to be right side up. So if we go back to the case, the 2.5-inch drive bays, so that's what this SSD is. It's a 2.5-inch SSD, which is generally found in laptops. But you're actually going to find that 2.5-inch drives are often installed in desktops nowadays. So the 2.5-inch drive bays are right here. These are also toolless. I don't believe you need a screw. I actually looked in the documentation, and it says there is one screw you're supposed to plug in, or screw in rather, but I don't really feel it's necessary. These 2.5-inch drive bays should be able to hold that drive in just fine, and these sort of work the same way. I have another picture here that's a little bit closer. So you would take one of these drive bays, and these are called brackets, and you would pinch these together, and then the drive bay pulls right out. And once you've pulled it out, you can take your drive. This would actually be, let's flip it just so we kind of can see what we're doing here. You would take this drive and see the screw holes here. Those would sort of sit right on the 2.5-inch bracket. And then that's it. You know, that's all you really need to do. And then you can just slide that bracket back into the drive bay. Now, the ports are going to know, or rather the plugs on the drive are now going to be in the back of the case. So our cable management is going to work out well for us in this case. We need to take the second SATA power connector. We can route it through back here, this grommet, up the back, and then pull it back in on this side. I've also seen pictures where you can actually route the cable all the way in the back here, and then route it up this way, and pull it into the back of the drive here as well. So the power cable is going to come up this way and plug into the back of the drive there, and then the SATA connector and the SATA data connector, you can connect to any one of these. So we would connect a SATA data cable to one of the free ports we have on the motherboard. And then once we're looking at the case, our drive should be installed. We're going to route that SATA cable. It's pretty close where you could probably get away with routing it directly. That shouldn't be a problem. Or if you really want to make it look neat, you could route it out through this grommet here, pull it over, and then pull it back in the case, back to the drive bay back here. And there you go. That's your SSD. That's your storage device. So we have a DVD drive where we can load our operating system. We've got a nice fast SSD where we can, store our operating system and store our data and files. And I think that's pretty much it for this tutorial, for this video. If there's any questions, it doesn't have to be about this case. Maybe you bought a different case and you're having some problems with it. I'm trying to make sure that when I describe how these things work, that you can take the knowledge and use it with any other kind of case. Not all cases are of a toolless design like this. Sometimes they come with screws, and it's a manual process to get them in there. But it should all be pretty apparent. Now you know kind of where everything fits, and that's really important. You know about different sizes of cases. You know about routing cables, what power cables do what, etc., etc. So hopefully this has garnered you some knowledge that you appreciate. So thanks a lot for watching this video, and we will move right on. In this video, we're going to hopefully take a look at our system and see if it boots. So I just want to say, first off, congratulations. You've built your system, and perhaps even your first system. So let's see if we can get this guy to start. First, we'll need to plug in the monitor. This motherboard has 3 different types of monitor connections, so you should have no problem finding a compatible monitor, or perhaps you even bought one. You'll also need to plug in the keyboard and the mouse, which are most likely USB, and if you have internet set up already, go ahead and plug in your network cable. Power up the system. Do you see any video? If you find that the system does not power on at all, let's take a look at a few steps we can take to try and figure out what the problem is. First and foremost, and this is so easily missed, even by the pros, the power supply that we selected has a master switch next to the power plug in the back of the power supply that goes to the wall. Be sure that this is in the on position before firing up your system using the button on the front of the case. If we still have no life, make sure the power coming from the wall is actually on. And don't laugh, sometimes the circuit breaker can be tripped, an outlet strip can be off, or perhaps the wall outlet is controlled from a light switch. Still no go. Well, let's get into the case, and let's make sure that we can tighten everything that we can see, the power cables especially. Still no go? Well, unfortunately, this is where we'll have to unplug just about everything from the motherboard except for the critical things. Unplug everything except for the power button cable, the power cables going from the power supply to the motherboard, and the CPU fan power cable. Now give it another shot. Unfortunately, at this stage, you're probably looking at a bad power supply or motherboard if the system does not turn on. You can try reinstalling the CPU, as some motherboards don't do anything without a working CPU. If you do see life when powering the system on, that's a pretty good sign. There's still some troubleshooting we'll need to do to figure out why this is happening. First off, we should install the speaker onto the motherboard. And you probably remember me talking about this and saying, you'll probably never need that. Well, I guess I'm a liar now. So get that speaker out, unplug the system, and install it onto the motherboard here. The red line of the speaker should be connected to pin 1, which is on the left here. Plug in and turn the computer back on and see if you hear any beeps. If you do hear beeps, that's also a good sign. There is a reference for beep codes for every motherboard. Here is a short list of the codes for the motherboard that we used as an example in our first reference build. Figure out what the motherboard is whining about by figuring out which beep code you're hearing. So our first beep code is 1 long and 2 short beeps. And in this case, the system does not detect any memory. Try taking the memory out and reseating it, or you could also try just 1 stick of memory at a time, and perhaps 1 is bad. The next beep code is 1 long and 3 short beeps. In this case, the system does not detect any kind of video card. This includes the video processor on your APU. And just an FYI, I do reference the APU as a CPU in this tutorial in case that's confusing. Be careful when reseating the APU, especially with regards to the pins, as we've gone over before. If you do reinstall the APU, be sure to completely clean off the silicone thermal grease before applying new grease. Do not use the old grease. These beep codes will happen if you do have video. 1 short beep, which means it cannot detect the keyboard. Try another USB port for your keyboard. 2 short beeps means your hard disk or SSD is bad. This will almost never happen with a new build unless you're using remanufactured products. And finally, 4 short beeps means something is seriously wrong with the system temperature-wise. Be sure all fans are spinning, especially the CPU. If it's not, immediately turn it off and find out why. Perhaps the power cable is bad or broken, or perhaps there's just some kind of blockage blocking the fan from spinning. So what if we have no beeps? If you see power getting to the motherboard, but you don't hear any beeps, it's very possible that the motherboard is bad. You can try reversing the speaker polarity just in case that was a mistake, but for all intents, we're out of luck here, and we need to think about replacing the board. Now what if the system powers on, it boots, and you get a message that says no operating system or no boot device or something along those lines? Well, congratulations, because you've made it to the end and you have a working system. But we can't really do anything with the system without some kind of operating system to run it. So that's what we'll go over in our next section. In this video, we're going to be installing Windows 7 on our machine that we've built. And you should be pretty excited at this point because very soon we're going to have a fully functioning system that you've built from scratch. So in order to get Windows to install, first we need to grab the CD, or rather the DVD that we purchased of Windows 7 for the system. And it's as simple as putting the DVD in the DVD drive and rebooting the computer, and Windows should actually start the installation process pretty quickly. Now, if that does not happen, there's a couple possible reasons why that may be the case. And what you see in front of you right now is a message that you could get when you first start the machine, asking you, if you want to actually boot from the DVD to start the installation process. So if you do see this message, you absolutely want to press any key to start that process. However, it is possible that the DVD drive is not set to boot as the first drive for the system to boot from. And if that happens, what you can do is, now this depends on the motherboard manufacturer, but with this particular motherboard that we've been using for this tutorial series, it's an ASUS motherboard. When you see the ASUS logo, if you press F8, it will give you a list of all the devices that are available to boot from. And you should see two devices here. You should see your SATA hard drive, the SSD that we installed, as well as your CD drive. And you'll obviously want to pick your CD drive to boot from. And then once you boot from that, again, you may see this message come up, and you'll want to hit any key to start that process. So I'm obviously, it may not be obvious, but I'm using a Mac. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to sort of show the Windows process, the installation process, without sort of having a camera, sort of recording it happen. And the reason for that is you can't really have a recording of the screen happen during a Windows install. So what I'm actually going to do is use a VM to install Windows on this machine. And it's very much the same process as you would do on your machine. All we need to do is to go through each part, and you would do very much the same thing on your machine as we do in the VM. And if there's any differences, I will be sure to point them out. So let's start that process now. I'm using a VM software called Parallels Desktop. Now you may see messages like this on your system. It may not look like this, but you'll see things like no boot devices available, operating system not found, etc., etc. So what we want to do is give the machine a CD or a DVD to boot from to start this process. So you would physically put your DVD in the drive, close it, and restart the computer, shut it off and turn it back on again. And the system should boot to that drive. So I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to do it virtually. So I have virtually connected a DVD drive that has the Windows DVD in it. So now if I go down here where it says no boot device available, press enter to continue. When I hit continue, cross my fingers, it should start the installation process. So here we are. Windows is starting its installation process. This is the exact same thing that you would see on your machine when you first start installing Windows from the DVD. So you'll notice that the screen keeps changing sizes on me, and that's really because of the virtual machine software. It's trying to fit the size of the window to be what you would see on a you know, the resolution of the screen that's currently showing. Thankfully, I can stretch it out each time so we can see what we're doing here. So this should be the first screen that you see. Once you successfully stick the DVD in, you start the boot process, this should be the first thing that you see. And, you know, depending on where you live or whatever, you can choose the options here. I'll do English in the US because that's where I am. And simply install now. So when we talked about the version of Windows that we were going to purchase for the system, you may have purchased Windows 7 Home. That's perfectly fine. There really isn't going to be that much of a difference between the two installations. I'm using Professional in this example. So we're just going to accept the license terms and hit Next. And in this section here, you really never want to hit upgrade. In fact, I recommend never upgrading a Windows operating system. Always start from scratch. So let's say if you wanted to go from Windows 7 to Windows 10, my recommendation would be to wipe the drive, install Windows 10 from scratch. So you would do that here under Custom. And this basically shows you the disks that are available to install the operating system on. And you should see your SSD here, or hard drive, you know, standard hard drive if that's what you purchased. If you don't see your hard drive here, that's a bit of a problem. You'll want to go through the system physically and make sure all the drives are connected and that there's power to them. With a spindle hard drive, you'll actually hear it spinning. If you don't hear it spinning, that's an issue. So you could go through the motherboard manual to sort of troubleshoot that. But probably your first step would be to unplug all of the drives and replug them back in, and then hop into the BIOS, which, you know, you can find the instructions for that in the motherboard manual, and make sure your drives are detected. Both drives are detected. All right, so our drive is detected here, and we're going to hit Next. This will install the operating system on this drive. So this is the first step of actually copying files to the disk. This will take a little bit, so I'm gonna sort of go on standby here, and we'll speed this up and maybe skip ahead in the video so we're not wasting so much time recording. All right, so once we have all the files installed, the system is going to reboot for you. So here we are. The system is restarting, changing my resolution on me again. I'll probably actually do it once more once it gets in. Yep. There it is. So there's my resolution changing again. So we're almost done getting the install completed. Now this is really, you know, it says completing installation, but this is really the file installation stage. There's a lot more to come to really turn this into a full-fledged working system with all the updates and all the software and drivers and security software installed. All right, looks like we're rebooting once more. And now Windows is doing its first-time analysis of your system. So here we are. We're in Windows now. We're not, you know, this is not booting from the CD anymore. In fact, at this point, you could probably take the CD out of the drive if you want. So let's create an account or a username. You know, you can obviously choose whatever you want. For this example, I'm not going to put a password because I don't want to type in my password every time. But I 100% absolutely recommend that you have a password on your user account. Use recommended settings. I recommend doing that. You know, if you're sort of an enthusiast, you may want to sort of do your own updates by yourself instead of having it do automatically. There are times where you don't want Windows to perform updates all the time, and that's true for gamers, because you don't want updates happening in the middle of a game you may be playing, because it'll really hinder the performance of the system. But for this system, we're just going to use recommended settings. And I am on the East Coast. And for this network, I'm going to say home, because that's where I am right now. Now what this does is if you select home network, you can actually create a home group for multiple systems, multiple Windows systems. And that allows you to share documents and music and pictures and whatnot across your network very easily. So we've created our account, and now we're being dumped to our desktop for the first time. And here we are. So at this point, one thing that we really have to do is make sure that our internet is working. That's not stretching very well, so let's fix that. You know, I'm running off of wireless here, and this VM is connecting right through that, so I don't have an issue with internet. However, if this is a new system and we've gone through the installation procedures, or we've installed the hardware as I've sort of explained so far, it's very possible that even though you have your network connected, you don't have internet, and that's because the network interface card drivers may not be installed. So there's a CD that comes with your motherboard, and if you don't have internet access right now because your network doesn't seem to be working, you'll need to install the network card drivers first. And one trick that I like to do to make the installation of drivers very easy is I use an automatic driver installation software called Slim Drivers. And it makes it so you don't have to go to all these different sites to find the drivers for your computer. It'll always download the latest drivers, and it does it all in one simple, easy to use interface. And it's a godsend for technicians that need to fix people's computers or update their drivers or whatnot. So our first step to get the network card drivers installed is to pop in your driver CD that came with your motherboard. And they're all different. This is the software that comes with the motherboard that we used as an example. Now you can absolutely install everything on here, but I actually don't recommend doing that, and I'll tell you why. A motherboard and its driver CD are pretty much automatically old, and we don't want old software and old drivers on our system. So we're just going to install the LAN driver, which is our network driver. LAN means local area network. And that's it. Once we have our LAN driver installed and we can connect to the internet, we're going to go and download Slim Drivers, and then we'll get all of the rest of the drivers and software installed that we need to. So that way we have all of the latest drivers, and it's very easy to do, and it's all done in one interface. So let's open Internet Explorer, which I really hate doing because I really hate Internet Explorer. But we'll get Chrome installed in a moment. So let's hop over to Google, and let's go to Slim Drivers. Awesome, awesome software. It's a really neat utility that allows you to I would recommend not doing this download from download.com because they may install some extra crap that we don't want in our system. I'm going to get it directly from driverupdate.net. So we're installing this. And whenever you install software off the internet, especially if it's free, we want to make sure that we're not installing extra stuff. It's really the only way free software, the people that make the free software make money, is by installing third-party applications. But a lot of times those third-party applications do a real number on your system as far as performance. So if we hit agree, you'll notice that it wants to install extra stuff. We're going to hit decline here. All right, so some drivers, we can close this for now. We're going to open up some drivers, do a scan, and it'll go away. So now this is a VM machine. There aren't a lot of drivers or updates for a VM machine. You're probably going to see a lot more for your system. So any devices that you see over here, we're going to go ahead and download the update. Now, the free version of Slim Drivers only allows you to download updates one at a time, unfortunately. But that's okay. We can deal with that. So while this is downloading, I'm going to show you the reason why we need to install all our drivers. It may look like we have a fully functioning system. Our network is up. We can get to the internet. We can obviously do things on the computer. But let me show you what's actually happening right now when it comes to drivers. There's something called Device Manager. And in Device Manager, it shows you all of the devices for your system. And if you look here, there are 3 different devices that don't have any drivers. That's what these exclamation points or splats are for. So these devices are non-functional. The operating system has no idea that they're there. Or rather, the operating system doesn't know how to communicate with them. So that's what we're doing when we're going out and grabbing drivers. Some of these are actually, they have placeholders installed for things like the video. So if you look at the menu here, it's using really kind of dumbed down graphics, and that's because it's sort of using a compatibility mode. So we're going to fix that too, so we can have better video. And once I do that, I'll actually be able to stretch this window out full screen. We can't do that right now without it distorting the image. So this is the network card drivers. I know we already have the network card installed, but we're doing this to, I'm sorry, this is the audio drivers here. So yeah, we have to get that installed because right now we have no drivers for it, as you can see right there. Okay, so whenever you see this come up, this looks really scary. Whenever you see this come up for drivers, it's perfectly fine to hit install this driver software anyway. As long as you know you're the one that caused this dialog to come up, you can hit install this driver software anyway. If at any time you see this come up when you're just using your system or on the internet or whatever, most likely you have a virus. There are viruses out there that mimic this window. You don't have to restart your machine every time you install a driver. I would just get them all installed and then we can restart once we're done. Yay. Nope. All right, so next up is our system devices, which is basically your motherboard hardware. So see, it's going out to get the controllers for the motherboard. And the great thing about this software is we don't have to go searching on websites and You know, especially if you have a homemade system where you have lots of different devices installed from different companies, you can get all of the drivers from one place, one piece of software. We're just going to hit next, next, next. These are drivers, so they don't generally have any extra software or garbage with them, so you can just hit next right through. Done. Nope. We will restart later. Yay. Nope. Now, I know that from my previous experience, this particular driver is not going to work with our system. So I'm just going to ignore that for now. All right, so we have our drivers installed. Now, I'm going to show you what it looks like now, and you may be surprised, but I'll tell you why it's happening. So if we go to Device Manager, we have two PCI devices left. And the reason for this, it really has to do with the Parallels desktop virtual machine software I'm running. And I'm going to go ahead and fix that now by installing some software that's required. Oops. Let's go back to that. Yep. So I'm not skipping this part because I want to make sure you understand, you know, where those two extra device manager splats are coming from and how we're solving it in this case. You won't see this on your end because you're not running Windows 7 in a VM. This will also fix my video card or video display capabilities. So when I come back, we should be able to use Windows in full screen. So you can see it in the background. The device manager is being refreshed, and it's finding devices to install. Oh, see that? No, one of them's gone. So this virtual printer we see that popped up here, this is a printer I have installed on my Mac. So it's a way for Windows in this VM to print to that printer. The splat probably means I have to install the LaserJet 2200 drivers inside of Windows. But we'll leave that alone. All right, so we're done with our tools installation. Hey, look at that. It found the drivers for me. Nice. For my printer. So we're going to go ahead and restart. Now, when we restart, we should have, at least on my side here, the video capabilities should kick in. And it'll probably be really, really small print, so I'll have to figure out a way to make sure that we can see everything. All right, so we're rebooting. Yep. See how the print went smaller? We're at a high resolution now. Yeah, this is all just security stuff from my Mac. It's all okay. You won't see those on your side. Let's see. ALS, Sound Manager. Yeah, we'll just say it works okay. All right, so now I should be able to resize the screen. There we go. Look at that. Hopefully you can read everything. Now you'll see that a lot of things are kind of screwy here with their layout and whatnot. And really, that's because of how the VM is working on my machine here. A lot of the text and the UI stuff is going to look strange, but you should not see that on your side. So we'll work with this and and get this system completed, even with these issues. So all of your devices should now be installed at this point. We'll go to Properties, check out the Device Manager, and we shouldn't see any splats. Awesome. So no splats means all our drivers are installed. All right. So the next step is to perform all of our Windows updates. Now, Windows 7 is aging, which means that there's a lot of Windows updates available for the operating system. So, unfortunately, we're really going to have to do all of these to get up to date and to have a secure system to work with. So, we're going to go ahead and check off all of these in Windows Update. We're going to actually scroll through the list here, make sure they're all checked. All right. And hit OK. And then start the installation. And this is going to take a long time, even on a fast internet connection. It's going to take a while. So I'm going to sort of take a pause here and let this let this install all of the patches that we need to, and I'll see you when it's done. All right, so we're back after installing some updates. So quite a bit of time, actually. Let's take a look and see how many we have left to do. And I think I'm going to actually skip the rest of these for now, just so we can get to... So this is wrong. There's definitely more than one update left. We'll throw it on check for updates for now to see what it can grab. So we have our drivers installed. We have our updates installed, or we're about to finish them. I will say that once you have updates done the first time, you want to reboot and go to check for updates again. Even though it says there was only one, there's got to be at least probably 30 or 40 left. You want to do that over and over again. Check for updates, check off all the ones that are available, install them, reboot, come back into the interface again and do check for updates again. Manually click the link here, because we want to make sure we get all of the updates available so our system is up to date and secure. So the next step after doing that, after we do all of the updates, we want to get some software. And I'm going to show you a really nifty site that I go to that generates an executable program that installs a whole bunch of other free programs that are very commonly used. That site is called ninite.com, or Ninite. I'm going to go to www.ninite.com. This is a really, really nifty piece of software. And what this does is you just select a whole bunch of different applications that you want. So for simplicity's sake, and to sort of get it done relatively quickly, I'm just going to choose Avast and Chrome. But I use probably 25% of the things on here. As an example, I use FileZilla for file transfers, Malwarebytes, Skype, Dropbox, Google Drive, a whole bunch of stuff on here. It's a real pain in the butt having to go to each individual website and download them all. This takes all of that work out, and it's literally just a one button click to get them all to install. So we've selected Chrome and Avast for security. We can close that for now. This is just bugging us about no security software. We're about to fix that. So we hit Get Installer. We download, and you'll notice that it's the beginning of the executable name is Midnight, and then it'll actually have all of the programs that you want or that you chose in the executable. It generates it. So you hit run, and then what this is going to do is it's going to download Chrome and Avast for us and install them without any. We don't have to do anything while this is doing this. So you could have 50 or 75 applications all installing for you without having to manage each download and go to each site and install them one by one. And there's another good thing about this, and that is you reduce the risk of installing garbage software that a lot of these free programs include in their installer. So now we don't even have to worry about that. Midnight takes that or deselects all of those options for you, so we don't have to have those extra pieces of software on our system, which is ideal. So we've got Avast completed. I'm sorry, Chrome is completed and it's installing. Avast is downloading next. And these should go pretty quickly, especially with the system that we built. This is probably going a little slower for me because I'm on a virtual machine. So Chrome's already installed. Look at that. So we can open that up if we want. Chrome, my favorite. And Avast antivirus is downloading. I chose Avast mainly because usually I use Microsoft Security Essentials, but they're actually phasing out that software. And by the time you look at this video, and very possible that it's not even available anymore. So if you're looking for free antivirus, AVG is good, Avast is good. If you're looking for paid antivirus, and if you have a, I know some people just have a knack for really getting viruses on their system, and I recommend paid antivirus for those people, mainly because they're a little bit more robust and can protect you a little bit better because it's a paid service. And the two pieces of software I recommend for that are Malwarebytes, which is actually free. There is a paid version. The paid version sort of sits in the background and checks things on the fly. The free version does not. And the other piece of security software is Kaspersky. Kaspersky, I used to sell at my business, and I would sell gazillions of copies of it, and people were just really enthused about it because they're used to the big names like Norton and McAfee, and those pieces of software really just get their hands deep into your system and can cause more problems than they solve. Kaspersky is not like that, and I would recommend that if you're, like I said, if you're prone to viruses and need some paid software. So Avast is almost done downloading here. It should be a pretty quick install. The one thing I don't like about Avast is that by default it talks to you, which is kind of weird to me. I'll show you in a second. Well, actually, you probably won't hear it in the video, which is good. But I'll show you how to turn it off once it's installed. Awesome. Avast is installed. And more likely than not, we're going to have to restart for the antivirus software to kick in. And once we come back, we'll take a look at what Windows updates it's found, because we asked it to go search for some more. Welcome to Avast. Okay, we're going to turn that off right now. So I believe it's under settings, sounds, no. Okay, no more sounds, thank you. All right, so it looks like it might be running a quick scan at the start here. That's cool. All right, so we have our security, we have Chrome, and any of the other optional pieces of software that you wanted should be installed. You should see a whole bunch of shortcuts down on the desktop here. But let's take a look at how many updates are actually available. See, 61 important updates. And if you see these, anytime you see these, you should install them. If some time goes by and you have automatic updates on, they will install on their own. But when you're first building your system, you want to keep coming in here and installing updates, check for updates, install updates, until you see no updates available. Then your system is done in terms of updates. Okay, so one last thing, we're actually pretty well complete here. We have a working system, we have a nice, we got some security software, we have a custom browser. I highly recommend not using Internet Explorer ever. Chrome is great, Firefox is great, it's really a personal preference at this point. But one last thing I want to show you is a way to sort of keep your system clean and really lean, so things aren't starting at startup that you don't want. And we're going to show you a way to do that. So there's this piece of software called CCleaner. I've used it for years and years, and it's really great. It just takes care of a lot. It basically what it does is it takes care of Windows. Windows doesn't really take care of itself very well. The longer you use it, the more it gets clogged with stuff, and and the average user just really doesn't know how to stay on top of that. And this application really helps with that problem. So even if you're not, even if you're just going through this course for informational purposes, hopefully I'm showing you some things that will keep your current system, up to date and performing well as well. All right, let's open this guy up. Yep. Yes. Here's an example where, I don't want extra things to install. Actually, I'm not sure if CCleaner does that, but I like to turn off all this stuff. I really just want, yeah, we'll keep these on actually. Yes, extra stuff. We don't want the extra stuff. So the reason I'm installing CCleaner manually is because it's not actually included in the Ninite list of software. It used to be, or I'm just missing it. Maybe it's there and I'm not seeing it, but they took it out for some reason. Okay, now we can see the full interface here. So in this list, what this does is like I said, it clears out a whole bunch of different things, temp files, registry, things that are left around in the Windows registry. For those who don't know, the Windows registry is basically the storage house for everything in terms of Windows and how it's configured and how software is configured. And a lot of times, applications will leave stuff in there, even if you were to uninstall them. And this application takes care of that. But in this list here, I like to, when I first start out with a new system, I like to check off pretty much everything in this list. So, some of these might look a little scary, like the start menu shortcuts and desktop shortcuts. What this does is, as an example, these two don't actually remove all your shortcuts. They remove shortcuts that are broken. So sometimes, applications will leave shortcuts on the desktop that they don't exist anymore, but they're still there. This will take care of that. And then some other stuff here. I'm checking off the things that I know won't cause you any grief. I have had issues where, checking off everything can do bad things. So I've had my entire start menu disappear. This guy, like all of these things disappear. So I don't do anything with the menu. Like that's pretty much what I do, is just leave those on like that. And applications, there's really nothing in there yet, but we're going to clear it all off anyway. Okay, hit run. Yes. It's not going to delete a lot of stuff, but you'd be surprised. So look at that, 1.2 gigabytes. So system error reporting is 1.2 gigabytes. I'm not sure what that's for. That's probably all of the Windows updates happening in the VM. So it's things like that. Like you would never know, never know that that's there. As a general user, it would just fill up your drive, and you just wonder why your system is running so slow. Okay, so let's go to registry, and there's really no reason not to check off all of these. This just checks for weird things going on in the Windows registry, things that shouldn't be there because they're moved or deleted, or the reference to them is no longer active. So fix, close. I've seen systems where the number of issues were in the thousands. It's really pretty crazy. And then lastly, this is my favorite, is the startup items. And once again, this is a great place to come when your system is taking forever to start. This is the list of items that are starting when your computer starts. Now, right now, obviously, it's pretty low. It's pretty minimal. But as you use your system and over the years you've installed programs and whatnot, this list can grow to 20, 25. I've seen up to 50 and maybe more different programs running at startup. And that's what causes the system to slow down. So in this list, the one thing I don't want is this CCleaner monitoring. There's no reason for us to have that. And there are things in Internet Explorer, Chrome, scheduled tasks. There are things you can remove in here that might, if there's things in here that you don't really, they look kind of fishy. Like there are like toolbars that are installed in Internet Explorer. You'll see those in here. You can go ahead and remove those. Scheduled tasks, I generally stay away from these. The Slim Driver startup, I don't want Slim Drivers to start up with my computer. I only used it once. That's the only time I need it. So I'm going to delete this. And the CCleaner skip UAC, this is really just a hack for CCleaner to sort of work the way it needs to, so that can stay. Context menu. Context menu is the right-click menu. So I'll show you what I mean. If you right-click anywhere, like on a file, I believe. Yeah, context menu. See this scan Avast UI? That's all coming from this context menu. All right, so that's pretty much it for the startup items. There are some new things here that you could certainly go through. If you have a bunch of files that, you have a large drive and maybe you have duplicates that you don't know about, you could use this. System restore. This is basically just a copy of the Windows built-in system restore to go back to certain points in time in case you're having problems with your system. But overall, I love this application. I've used it for years, like I said, and it's treated me very well, so I highly recommend it. And with that, I think we're done. Let me actually let's get rid of the auto hide, and let's tell CCleaner that we don't want you running, even though we already told it. This is a way to sort of shut it off now. All right, so that's it. You've got a working system. This little icon down here is telling me that there's updates. Like I said, if you see that icon, always install these updates. Check for updates regularly. You know, it's very good to do that to keep your system secure. All right, so you've got yourself a working computer. Congratulations. Any of the videos coming after this will most likely be videos responding to questions from people. I devoted a whole sort of separate section for that. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to contact me directly or leave a, some kind of comment in the discussion areas on the site. But I really appreciate you, taking a look at my video series, and hopefully it gave you some information that was valuable to you. And like I said, please contact me or whatever if there's anything you'd like to talk about. I do love talking to my students. If you feel that the course was beneficial to you and that there was some value to it, I would really appreciate it if I could get some reviews, some 5-star reviews. And if there's any issues that you've had with the course that I can fix or that we can discuss, please email me first before leaving a negative review. I would love to fix whatever issue you may be having, or if there's something that I can do, even refund the cost of the course that you paid, so that you can move on. All right, so thanks again.